great seeing everyone today. A few weeks ago, I got a call from Sheriff Leon Lott, who attends Gateway, and he said, Pastor, we have a promotion ceremony where we promote officers up a rank, and is there any way we can have it at our worship center? I said, absolutely. I'm going to always say yes to the sheriff. And so he said, well, it'll be a lot of officers and then their families. And then I said, well, Sheriff, normally we provide security for events like this. And he started laughing. He said, I think there are going to be enough guns there. I think we'll be all right. But anyway, I wasn't able to be there because I was out of the country with my teenage grandsons. I have 4 teenage grandsons, and I took them on a man trip. And each night we studied through Proverbs to discuss what a man of God is. And so we came up with 5 different qualities through Proverbs for them to study and learn about. But it was an amazing trip. And we spent 3 days in Paris and 3 days in Normandy. It was just one of those magical times. The very first night, I knew things were going to be great after the first night. We rented a Airbnb so that we could just be in a normal Paris neighborhood so they could see how people normally live there. And that very first night, Paris soccer team was playing in this big tournament, and I don't even remember what it was, but it was a big deal. And they won, and 3 of my grandsons play soccer, and so they were all into it, and they were Paris fans, and they were watching it on TV, and it was late at night. And when they won, they just started screaming and hollering, and then they ran, just all of a sudden I realized they ran out of the house and into the neighborhood, and I'm like, oh my gosh, 3 teenage youth from America got arrested for screaming, and but anyway, all of a sudden I realized the whole neighborhood was out there. Everybody was out there screaming and hollering and celebrating. So I thought, well, this is really cool. They get to experience this of another culture, and so I said, we're off to a good start. And so our last 3 days, though, were in Normandy, and it was when Normandy was getting ready to have their celebration for D-Day, so everybody was starting to come in there, and they said there'd be about 30 World War II vets that would come for that. There's not a lot of them left, and so we were eating lunch. It was on the very last day after we'd been exploring all the different aspects of D-Day, and we were walking along the beach and where the invasion took place. We walked through the cemetery. We were the last day we were in Santa Maria Glisse, I think is the name of it, and that's where that parachute guy landed on the steeple of the church, and they actually keep a mannequin and a parachute on the steeple of that church even today to remember that guy. And so we were there, and we went into a restaurant for lunch, and there was some United States Air Force pilots in there, and I noticed that they were C-130 pilots, and we had watched some C-130s fly very low along the beach when we were walking on the beach. So I went up and I said, were you guys flying the C-130s along the beach? And they said, yeah. I said, well, we waved at them. And we waved at you. He said, yeah, we saw you. I said, God, no, you didn't. Why would you say that? And so they got my grandson, took pictures of my grandson, and then sitting right behind us was a World War II vet. And so we went over and talked to him, introduced. He's 101 years old, and he had fought right in that city. And I said, wow, guys, this is really amazing. You're getting to meet this guy. And then when we walked out from lunch, these 3 Sherman tanks came from World War II, came rumbling down the road. And so these were, actual tanks. And so, I was talking to some of the people that were driving a lot of the old World War II Jeeps, and there were just hundreds of them. and come to find out, they're all authentic, and they're all owned by private individuals, and they maintain them. And the tanks were owned by private individuals, and they maintain them, and they bring them to these events. Or to this event. And so it was just a perfect way to end our time there so that the guys could have an appreciation. Two of my grandsons are 17 and to walk along a beach, and they realized that 17-year-olds were coming ashore there, and some 17-year-olds are actually buried at the cemetery there. And it just had a real touching moment for them to grab hold of the price paid by young people for their freedom. And so I loved our time together and loved being able to invest in them. And but it's always good to get back home and be back with you. And we're doing this series through the 7 churches in the book of Revelation, and we're doing the second church today, the church at Smyrna. And so we're going to be in Revelation chapter 2, beginning at verse 8. And so let's begin reading, and then I'll talk through as we read through the scripture on this. And so remember, these are letters that were physically written by the Apostle John as dictated to him by Jesus Christ. So Jesus wrote these letters through the Apostle John. John actually wrote them down. Jesus told him what to say. And then these letters were then sent to these 7 different churches. And so you can imagine getting a letter from Jesus. And so let's begin reading with that in mind. It says, "Write this letter to the angel of the church in Smyrna. This is the message from the one who is the first and the last, who was dead and is now alive." So Jesus Christ is obviously the person talking about. He's the first and the last, so he's the Alpha and the Omega. There's nothing before him and there's nothing after him. And he was dead in that he was crucified, and now he's alive, he's resurrected. And then the first thing he says, I know about your suffering and your poverty. So Jesus Christ, he understands suffering. He understands what it's like to go through difficult times. And this church in Smyrna was a church, now it was in the church of a very large, popular, rich city. In fact, it had this great harbor, and it was at the end of a very big road. In fact, the biggest street was called the Golden Street. It went around the hills around the city, and so they would actually call that part of the street the Crown. And around that circled all these different temples to false gods. There was one for Zeus, one for Apollos, one for Aphrodite, and all these temples to different false gods along the Golden Street. So it was a beautiful city. It was had an amazing reputation. It was considered one of the nicest cities in all of Asia, and the city prided itself as such. And they prided themselves because of their richness, because of their culture, because of their reputation. And in this city is a group of Christians, and they have a church. And so Christians were in the city, but not part of the city. They weren't a part of that culture. They did not worship at the different false god temples. And so the Christians were there to be a witness, and they were growing. There were many Jews that were becoming believers. There were a lot of Gentiles becoming believers. And so they were on the other side of this beautiful part, and they felt outside of all that, and they were actually starting to suffer in their lives. And so here's what Jesus said to them. He said, I know. I understand. And basically he's saying to them, I want you to look up to heaven, and I want you to look ahead. So instead of looking down at your circumstances, looking at the right now, I want you to look up to heaven. I want you to look beyond this life, and that's how you're going to get through this. You see, God's goal in your life, you got to remember this. His goal is not for your happiness. Now, in the word happy, there are 3 letters, H-A-P, hap. That comes from an old English word that means chance. And I think that's kind of appropriate. Happiness is usually by chance. Circumstances work out for you, or certain things happen your way, and so you're happy about this. A lot of times things that you have no control over, and it makes you happy. And so happiness, it comes and goes based on your circumstances. Well, God, in all honesty, that's not what he's concerned about. God is more focused on something that is higher, something that is more holy, something that is actually heavier. God is more concerned about you being in the image of his Son. So instead of your happiness, God is focused on your holiness, being in the image of his Son. So Jesus is saying to them, he says, look, I know. I understand. I personally understand suffering. I know the suffering you're going through. I'm aware. This is not something I'm not aware of. And so Jesus is telling them in verse 10, don't be afraid. So he's saying, look up, look ahead, but don't be afraid. Now, when Jesus says don't be afraid, he's not saying don't feel anything. He's not saying that. He's saying trust me in your fears. Jesus is not saying deny your emotions, pretend like everything's hunky-dory, everything's okay. He's not saying that at all. Some people think that not being afraid means not having feelings of fear. It's what you do with that fear. It's what you do in the moment. So you'll feel fear, but you allow your faith to help you to overcome your fear, to get beyond your fear. So being faithful, being a person of faith, does not mean you never fear. Doesn't mean that at all. In fact, Jesus, the night he was arrested, he didn't have fear, but he didn't want to experience what was coming. It wasn't his first choice. He said so. But he chose to be a person who trusted the Father, and he faced it in spite of the feelings. A lot of people think that this is, some people think that being a Christian, it means you're not a person of fear. You just kind of, which is really an Eastern mysticism kind of philosophy, that not being afraid means not having feelings of fear. A lot of people think that that's how Jesus lived. I don't know about you, but when I was younger and I saw a movie about Jesus, usually the movies about Jesus then, you wondered, this guy just seems to be on drugs or something. He does like no emotions whatsoever. He just kind of says the words, and he just kind of walks along and does things, but no emotions whatsoever. And that's just not that's just not realistic. That's not who Jesus was. The Bible tells us he got angry, he was happy, he cried, he wept. So Jesus wasn't a person that didn't experience fear, or a person that had no emotions. When Jesus says, don't be afraid to this church, when he says it to you, he's not saying, don't feel anything. He's not saying that. But rather, he's saying, you can trust me in everything. Even when life throws you the very worst, I'm not asking you to live in denial. Just know that I am with you and I'm going to get you through it. I want you to look at what's beyond what you're going through. The Bible's not saying, just pretend like everything's going to be okay. It doesn't say that. Life's going to turn out perfect. It might not. You might go through a situation and it might not resolve in a good way. Your situation may not end the way you were praying that it would end. You see, life may not turn out perfectly for you. But he is saying, learn to live in faith no matter what life throws at you. Don't be afraid. So what does it mean not to be afraid? It means you realize that no matter what happens in life, God's going to take care of you. I'll never forget the time when Mac was a year old. And he had started running a fever. And we were at the house, the three of us. And Mary got on the phone with the doctor, and she was literally talking on the phone with Mac's doctor. And I was holding Mac, and he was just burning up. His fever was starting to hit about 105. And we were trying to figure out what to do. And all of a sudden, he went into convulsions, and then he just stopped breathing. Actually started turning blue. And man, in that moment, I'm a person of faith, but I want to tell you, fear overcame me. Like I'm sitting there going, I'm about to watch my son die. And so the doctor told Mary, he says, immediately call 911. And fortunately, the fire department's just a couple blocks away, and they were there shortly. And they got him on oxygen, and the ambulance came, and Mary and Mac got in the ambulance, and I'm following in the car. And I want to tell you, that was the longest drive of my life, following that ambulance. Because I'm sitting there in the car praying for God to intervene, for God to do something, and I was afraid. But at the same time, I knew I could trust God, but I was still afraid. Because I didn't know if my son was going to make it to the hospital. I didn't know if we'd get to the hospital and I find out he had died along the way. I didn't know, did he get oxygen soon enough? Did he have some brain damage? Did he have something that was going to be permanent? I didn't know. Later we found out he had a rare blood disorder. But in that moment, everything was okay, and he got through that crisis. But in the moment, yes, I was afraid, but I still trusted God. I still trusted him that he would get me through it, that he would get us through it. It wasn't easy, but I could trust God. So he's not saying don't feel anything. He's saying trust me no matter what the feelings are. That's what faith is. So here's a couple of things I want you to see about Jesus. In verse 9, he says, I know about your suffering. I know about your poverty, but you are rich. You see, you got to look at things through God's eyes. Through God's eyes, you're rich. Through man's eyes, you're dirt poor. You're not participating in the wealth of this city. So you're kind of at the bottom end of the totem pole. You're rejected. You're looked down upon. You're mocked. You're made fun of. But Jesus says, hey, I know. I wrote down some phrases that I don't think you'll ever hear come from the mouth of God. I don't think God will ever say, well, I didn't see that coming. Or, well, that's a total shock to me. Or, run that by me again, I don't understand. Or, you got to be kidding. Those are phrases I don't think God's ever going to say. Why? Because he already knows everything. And Jesus is God, and he absolutely knows everything. So he says, I know. I know everything you're going through. I know what you're feeling. I know your struggle. I know what you're dealing with right now. I know. That's what Jesus is saying. I know every detail of it. I know what you're going through, Don't be afraid about it. And then in verse 10, Jesus said, let's stop here for a second. Listen to what they were dealing with. Because see, he says, I know the blasphemy of those opposing you. And some of the ones that were opposing them were the Jews, because there were some Jews that were becoming believers, and that was, the synagogue didn't like that, and so Jesus said, they say that they're Jews, but they are not. And listen to this, because their synagogue belongs to Satan. Man, that's quite an indictment from Jesus himself. And let's be really honest here. There are some churches in the United States today that Jesus would say the same thing. He would say, that church belongs to Satan because of what they promote. That church belongs to Satan because they deny me. That church belongs to Satan because they pervert the Scripture. And you could just keep going down the list. If a church, any church that takes its eyes off of Jesus and puts it on man's opinions and man's feelings, it becomes a church of Satan. Then Jesus says, don't be afraid, verse 10, of what you are about to suffer. So he's talking about some future things here. He's saying, don't be afraid of what you are about to suffer. So Jesus, he knows the future. He knows what's going on. He says, so you don't need to be afraid about it. The devil will throw some of you into prison to test you. You will suffer for 10 days. I can't even begin to unpackage what all that means, so we're not going to camp there very long. But here's what I take away from that. Jesus is sovereign. Even when Satan is allowed to mess with us, it's only in the parameters that Jesus sets. Jesus is sovereign. And Satan is submissive to his sovereignty. He has no choice. He has no choice. He says, you will suffer for 10 days, but if you remain faithful, even when facing death, I will give you the crown of life. So Jesus is, look at some of these verses and what they tell us about Jesus. Verse 8, this is a message from the one who's first and last. Well, that means he's eternal. So Jesus is eternal. And then who is dead and is now alive, so he's resurrected. That means he is resurrected. He is victorious. Verse 9, I know about your suffering. So he's all-knowing. I know about your suffering and your poverty, but you are rich. So he is wise. He sees things for what they really are, not what they seem to be. He's saying, yeah, you think you're poor, but you don't realize you're really rich, because the way I count wealth is very different. And then he said, don't be afraid for what you're about to suffer. The devil will throw some of you into prison to test you. You will suffer for 10 days, but I will give you the crown of life. So he is sovereign. So Satan has to operate within his parameters. Anytime anything happens to me, it's only because of God's permission. Now, I can do stupid stuff, and I face consequences of that. So that's not like God made me do things to punish me. That's not what that is. That means I'm facing consequences of my bad decisions. But in this case, Satan is allowed to test them, but it's under the sovereignty of God, and God sets limits, and that's what he did here. And he said, but if you remain faithful, even when facing death, I will give you the crown of life. So he's purposeful. He's also generous. This is the Jesus that we still serve today. He knows everything you're going through. He is sovereign. He's purposeful in it. He is generous. And you can trust him. You can absolutely trust him. So the persecution's coming from the powerful, for one thing. The Roman government. You had to worship Caesar. It's coming from the culture. You see, Smyrna, they had a temple to the Emperor Tiberius. A bunch of cities had petitioned and fought for this temple, but Smyrna won that battle, and so they were very proud of their emperor worship. And it sort of identified them, and people would come to go visit these temples to the different emperors. And it made their city something above all the other cities in Asia. And so this city was very prideful about this. And they were proud of their various temples. They were proud that people would come to see them and to see their city. And then these Christians, they're over here. And the prevailing culture had to look at them and say, well, why are they even here? And they don't even worship the emperor. You're required to. And so this is the way culture is going. You need to go this way. And they're over here saying, no, we don't worship Caesar. We worship Jesus alone. And then there was the jealousy of the Jewish people. They were jealous of the Christians' success in winning people to Christ. And then there's the evil one himself. They were facing all of these things. The powerful people in the culture itself, the Jewish people and their jealousy, and then Satan himself. And in verse 10, Jesus said, remain faithful. Remain faithful. You need to know about a certain man, a member of this church in Smyrna. Very likely, he was a member of the church when this letter was written and arrived. So imagine he is hearing this letter along with everybody else. In fact, later he became the pastor of this church. He may have been the pastor when the letter arrived. And if so, he would have been the one who received it and read it. And most likely, he knew the Apostle John personally and may have been discipled by him. So, in fact, 50 to 70 years after Paul wrote a letter to the Philippi, this guy wrote a letter as well. And we know about that letter. We have copies of that letter. And so this guy, his name was Polycarp. So Polycarp, he's a guy you need to know. Can you imagine being a member of this church and you get a letter from Jesus? That's just, overwhelming to think about. And so Polycarp became the head pastor of this church. But something happened on February 22nd in the year 156. Polycarp was captured by the government and was brought into the middle of the city into an amphitheater to stand before the proconsul. And he was asked to deny his faith and the leader of the Christian church. He was asked to bow down to Caesar. And they even tried to be kind to him because he was an old guy at this moment, over 80 years old. And they said to him, we know you're an old man, so just bow down quickly and we'll wipe it all out and everything will be okay. And then what Polycarp said is recorded and is well known that what he said. He said, 86 years I have served him, Jesus, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my King who saved me? Now that's faithfulness. That's a true picture of faithfulness. And because of that, he was sentenced to death. And he became the earliest well-documented Christian martyr outside of the New Testament. You know, we don't have to deal with that kind of stuff today. But yet, in a way, we do. We're often enticed to deny Jesus by being drawn into behavior that's contrary to Jesus. We're often enticed to deny Jesus by going down a path of our choosing and not his. We're often enticed to, we accept him as our Lord and Savior. We'll trust him with our eternal soul, but entrust him with my daily life, that's a different matter. So we all struggle with the same thing in the same way. So I wonder what you struggle with today. What are you enticed by? What draws you away from Jesus? Because Jesus, I promise you, has never done you no wrong. As we prepare, we're going to share in communion today. And it's a perfect fitting as we think about Jesus and think about Polycarp and that he was willing to give up his life. I mean, he could have easily saved his life just by dropping to his knees for a second and getting back up, and all would be forgiven. But he was not willing to do that. So as our men prepare to serve us the communion today, I want you to begin to pray about and think about what Jesus has done for you, his faithfulness to you. And as they pass communion, I want you to just hold on to it. We'll share in it together at the end. And I want you to think about what Jesus has done for you and what are you going to do for him. So, men, as they begin to pass these out, you think about what the Lord is saying to you. You spend time thinking and reflecting on his faithfulness to you.